Is civil unrest about to strike? Could peaceful protests turn violent? What's up, my preppers? A lot of people are asking these types of questions, and for good reason. Preppers want to know the early signs of civil unrest so that they can take the preparations and precautions should that unfold and turn into riots that could threaten their home or their family or just their commute to work. This is particularly important if you live in an urban environment. Of all of the challenges that we as preppers face, civil unrest might be one of the most unpredictable ones. It can seemingly happen at a moment's notice, particularly in the Western cultures such as ours, where we are becoming desensitized to a lot of the hot button issues that are being pushed on social media or even news outlets, sowing division, resentment, and frustration with others. So we may not even recognize the signs sometimes that civil unrest is coming straight at us because we have become so desensitized to these issues. In this video, we're going to look at some historical examples of civil unrest so that we can get an idea on what causes it. And then we're going to look at 9 signs that you can watch for to know that civil unrest or riots are about to unfold near you, and you have the time to take the precautions and preparations to either be ready for them and or to escape that. What exactly are we talking about here with civil unrest? What's the definition that we're going to use? For that definition, we're going to go to the U.S. Code on Civil Disorders. The term civil disorder means any public disturbance involving acts of violence by assemblages of 3 or more persons which causes an immediate danger of or results in damage or injury to the property or person of any other individual. Put more simply, civil disorder is an activity like a demonstration, a strike, or a riot that turns hostile to another person or authority. So, using that definition, the Women's March in D.C. on January 1, 2017, the day after Trump's inauguration,
is with me. We choose love.
My message to him is listen to your people.
Despite being the largest single-day protest in U.S. history at the time, of around 500,000 people, would likely not fit the definition of a civil disturbance. There was mostly no harm to anyone or destruction of property. Peaceful protests on their own are not civil unrest. However, there are many examples of civil unrest in the United States starting in 1783 to the current year. Those examples are more aligned with riots than they are protests. They are similar, but they are distinctly different. For our purposes, I'm going to use riots and civil unrest interchangeably because in my mind, they more or less mean the same thing. Riots usually equate to harm toward another person or destruction of property. It's going to be helpful to understand why riots happen in the first place. And to do that, we're going to look at some historical examples in the United States, focusing on some of the more violent riots that have happened. The first being the draft riots in 1863 in New York City, when the draft for Union soldiers turned very violent. If you could pay $300 at the time, around 10 grand today, you could avoid being drafted. Manhattan's Irish immigrants could not afford that, and out of resentment, they turned against the black community. Many buildings were burned and 120 people were killed. In fact, many of the worst riots in U.S. history have racial undertones. The Atlanta race riot of 1906 was particularly brutal, beginning after unsubstantiated reports of black men raping white women. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, when mobs of white residents, some of them appointed as deputies and armed by government officials, attacked and destroyed black homes and businesses. The 1967 Detroit riot was a particularly bloody riot, spurred after a police raid of a bar where they roughed up patrons. It quickly spiraled out of control, lasting 5 days. The Michigan National Guard was called in. President Johnson sent in the Army's 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. There were 43 deaths, over 1,000 injuries, and over 400 buildings were destroyed. The list of racially motivated riots and civil unrest goes on and on. George Floyd, Rodney King being more recent examples, but economics can also spur riots. The New York City blackout of 1977 is well known for the looting and destruction that followed. The nation as a whole was suffering from a protracted economic downturn, but New York City was particularly hard hit. Looting and vandalism ensued, 35 blocks of Broadway were destroyed, 550 police officers were injured, and 4,500 looters were arrested. While mostly peaceful in comparison, the Occupy movement of 2011 was also based on economic inequality, using the "We Are 99% slogan as opposed to the wealthy 1%. Here are a few other examples of riots that fall outside racially motivated unrest and economics.
I remember this. 50 years ago today, the McAllister prison was burning.
The Oklahoma State Penitentiary riot of 1973, the worst prison riot in U.S. history. The prison was built for a capacity of 1,100 inmates, but by the time the riot broke out, the population had doubled. The prison was overcrowded and there were just too few correctional officers. 21 prison officials were taken hostage, but soon the inmates turned on each other and the prison went up in flames. Politics also plays a part, as evidenced by the Capitol Hill riot on January 6, 2021, when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building. 5 people died and many were injured. Food shortages can also spur unrest. There are countless examples of that throughout history. In the U.S., we had the Southern bread riots in 1863 when hungry women and men invaded and looted various shops and stores. It's important to note that the people that were involved in those 1863 bread riots were not, in fact, starving. I'll get back to that point in just a moment. So what exactly is the cause of these various examples of riots and civil unrest? The common theme here is that you have one population, one group of people who are feeling that their rights are not equal to another group's, that they are economically disadvantaged by the structure of our system, or their race means that they are discriminated against in laws and opportunities. So you have marginalization of a population that gets angry at their marginalization, and the only recourse that they see available to them is to riot, picket, loot, destroy, basically bring down the man. So while civil unrest may seem like impromptu, sudden event, it's often the result of an ongoing, brewing dissatisfaction and anger. A study by the Royal Society, which looked specifically at causes of riots, stated that perhaps the leading psychological explanation for riots has been relative deprivation theory, RDT. RDT stated that when people perceive a difference between what they have and what they believe they deserve, they feel relatively deprived. As the perceived disparity grows, so do frustration and resentment, increasing the likelihood for engagement in collective violence. This theory has contributed to explaining puzzling cases of collective violence, such as the bread riots of the 18th century, in which people may not have suffered from starvation, but engaged in collective violence, possibly because what drove them to act was the relative, i.e., when compared with other groups in society, and not absolute level of deprivation. Now that we have a general idea of what causes riots, inequality, and injustice, we can look for the signs that civil unrest is about to ensue. So it should probably come as no surprise that the first sign of potential civil unrest, riots, is going to be this growing sense of injustice, i.e., relative deprivation, the two most common being racial injustice and economic injustice. Heightened racial or ethnic conflicts are a serious warning sign of potential unrest. When communities are divided along racial or ethnic lines, incidents of violence can quickly spiral into larger conflicts. Hate crimes, racially motivated violence, and inflammatory rhetoric from leaders or media outlets can all contribute to a volatile environment. Economic instability is also a powerful catalyst for civil unrest. A sharp rise in unemployment, inflation, or food prices can lead to widespread dissatisfaction and protests. Economic discontent is often the tipping point that turns peaceful demonstrations into violent clashes. People who are struggling to make ends meet are more likely to take to the streets, especially if they feel that the government is not addressing their concerns. So this structural sense of injustice is what's going to drive people together to form a collective identity, an us versus them situation. So monitor the news for any signs that this is brewing up, that people are becoming more angry, more frustrated. So the second indicator that civil unrest might be approaching where you live is going to be protests and civil unrest and riots in other places. Protests are a common way for people to voice their dissatisfaction with government policies or economic injustices. And while peaceful protests are a normal part of a functioning democracy, a noticeable increase in the frequency, size, and intensity of protests can be a red flag. When protests begin to turn violent or lead to widespread property damage, it's a clear sign that tensions are reaching a boiling point. Civil unrest loves momentum. The people love to see their message and their actions spread to other cities, other countries, other communities, and there are plenty of historical examples of this happening.
I'm tired of my black men and my black women being shot, being killed by the NYPD.
A few include the 2020 George Floyd riots that started in Minneapolis but rapidly spread to other cities, the same as the 1967 Detroit riots, and even the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia but spread throughout many countries in the Middle East and North Africa. When rioting is happening in other places, those who feel that same type of injustice, who align economically or racially or ideologically with that group that is doing the protesting, they feel empowered to join the movement, and that together, whether they're in another country or another state or even another city, together their voice gets louder and they build momentum for change. The next indicator will be growing political anger. Anyone that's been paying attention to any of the news or even social media comments, etc., in the last several years has seen this growing political social divide in the country. That's exacerbated by media outlets that cater to one particular side, demonizing the other side, stoking anger and frustration and blame on the other side. And this can be spurred, civil unrest can be spurred by elections, passage of controversial legislation, or court rulings. And you'll notice this polarization in the form of aggressive rhetoric from political leaders, media outlets, and even among your friends and family. When debates turn into shouting matches and compromise becomes impossible, the stage is set for conflict. Contentious elections can set the stage for large-scale demonstrations between opposing sides, particularly if the results of the election are seen as illegitimate. In response to rising tensions, governments may increase security measures and deploy the National Guard or impose curfews. While these actions are often intended to restore order, they can sometimes have the reverse effect. People can see the heavy hand of the government or the military as an instrument of keeping them down, of supporting the other side, and that can lead to violent clashes between the military or police presences and demonstrators. The next indicator is going to be growing religious conflict. Religion ranks right up there with politics on things that can incite violence, riots, and demonstrations. There are many, 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 many historical examples of religious differences between populations leading to violent clashes and all-out war. As is the case with injustice, usually there's an underlying tension that is building and building and building until it eventually is unleashed, sometimes violently, but sometimes in more subtle ways, like pranksters. For example, here in Maine, in Lewiston, Maine, a number of years ago, there was a guy who thought it might be funny to roll a pig's head into a mosque. Not many people laughed. Fortunately, that led more to community dialogue, but it easily could have spread out of control and resulted in violent clashes within the city of Lewiston, Maine. Now, that example brings us to the next indicator that civil unrest might be about to explode, and that is a triggering event. In most cases, historically speaking, you can point to a single trigger event that spurred violent clashes. In all cases, there was underlying tension that was building, as we discussed, but there's a trigger event that prompts people to say they finally have had enough. It's the straw that has broken the camel's back. And so when that trigger event happens, it's the final straw that prompts people to take to the streets and demonstrate and often commit acts of violence. And I provided examples of this already, trigger events that have happened, Rodney King verdict, the New York City draft riots, assassination of Martin Luther King, etc. So if there is tension building in a community and then there is a trigger event that happens and people explode in anger, that's your cue that social unrest is about to occur and you need to take precautions. Then you have agitators. Agitators are people or groups of people who claim to speak on behalf of a population, to represent a population, and they are good at stoking that underlying anger and motivating people to take action. And these people are really good at what they do. They want action. They want to be seen as the leader of some particular movement. They want that group to take violent action on their own behalf, or at least that's the way they'll pitch it. And they'll leverage media to amplify their message. So they effectively weaponize crowds, and we have plenty of historical examples of this as well. There's Vladimir Lenin, who took Russians' frustrations with post-World War I Russia. His efforts had led to the October Revolution and the overthrow of the Russian government. The Weather Underground Group here in the United States was a radical left-wing organization in the US in the 1960s and 1970s. They advocated for a violent overthrow of the US government and carried out bombings of government buildings. So if you see or hear agitators amplifying their message and their message gaining traction with populations, then that's a good indicator that riots might be coming your way. And in that same vein, next would be media amplification. We talked about that brewing underlying tension that brews up into demonstrations and civil unrest and riots. Well, a symbol of or a reflection of that, an indication of that brewing tension can be seen in social media channels, posts, videos, and in the news outlets. So if you're seeing an increasing level of distrust, anger, frustration in social media, on news reports, then that's an indicator that we might be reaching a tipping point and social unrest, civil unrest might soon ensue. And those media outlets often stoke this anger because it's good for their ratings. It's good. They like to divide the crowd because when their crowd, their audience is getting more and more angry, that's good for their ratings. That's good for their bottom line. They like the people, us, to be divided. They don't want unity. Unity, for their purposes, is boring. People don't care about boring. People don't click on, hey, everything's great. People click on, hey, everything's really shitty and it's getting worse. And the agitators have gotten really good, like content creators have, at manipulating media to advance and expand their reach. So they know the algorithms, much like content creators do. They're very savvy. They have teams that do this. And that's your indicator. If agitators are amplifying their message across social media and social media is responding, people are doing their own posts, this movement is building, civil unrest is coming. The next one's a little bit different, and that's a breakdown in services. You remember Hurricane Katrina? As though that wasn't bad enough, the government then told people that were stranded to go to the Superdome as their shelter of last resort. The government was not prepared for the influx of people that arrived there. And I remember some of the interviews of people at the Superdome. Frustrations were building. There was no clean water. There was very little food. Parents didn't have diapers for their kids. It was a really nasty, messy, ugly scene. Reports of crime within the Superdome. So that really could have blown out of control very quickly. And there are other historical examples of this happening. Referencing Lenin again, Lenin said that society, I'm paraphrasing here, society is only 3 meals away from chaos. So when services break down, whether that's a natural disaster, a political coup, or any other reasons, if people don't think that they're going to get what it is that they need in order to survive, panic sets in, panic buying happens, chaos ensues on the streets, they protest, they don't know what else to do, they're nervous, they're scared, civil unrest occurs. So if there's any breakdown in government services with no seeming hope of soon fixing that problem or recovering services, and panic buying is happening and the shelves in grocery stores are empty, people are going to get nervous, people aren't ready for this, they're going to get scared, they're going to go to the streets, violence is going to ensue, and you need to be ready for that, hopefully in advance with having your own preps in place. Now, this last indicator is a reflection of the fact that civil unrest, social mayhem, riots, violence on the streets can happen seemingly for really bizarre reasons. And that would be significant sports games. How many times have we seen riots and mayhem in the streets after a big sports game? People get drunk, they go on the streets, they fight with the fans of the opposing side, they flip police cars, they start fires in the street. It's chaos, it's crazy. Now, the worst examples are often soccer games in other countries, but it's happened in the United States many times before. The Detroit Tigers World Series win in 1984 was followed by cars being set on fire and stores being looted. The same happened after the Chicago Bulls NBA championship wins in the 1990s. The San Francisco Giants World Series victories, and on and on. The fact that this can happen at seemingly any moment underscores the importance of preparing in advance, because once it happens, it's too late to prepare. And of course, you always need to maintain situational awareness, which is really what this video has been about. The indicators that civil unrest can happen, i.e., keeping alert for these indicators, i.e., situational awareness. So remember that preparation is not just about stocking supplies. It's about being smart. It's about knowing what can happen. It's anticipating when it can happen, knowing the signs that things can happen. As always, the goal here is not to live in fear. I don't want anybody living in fear. The goal is to be prepared, to have the mental skills to recognize what might be coming your way in advance of it happening so that you have the time to get out of the way, ideally. Stay informed, stay prepared, stay safe.